Hello and welcome back. On this channel I talk a lot about books and literature, and this month I'm talking about adaptations of books as movies or TV series. This video is about the Harry Potter movies and ranking them in terms of how strong they are as an adaptation of the books. Now by that I don't necessarily mean just faithfulness to the books, because sometimes faithfulness to the books won't make a great movie. There are things that work well in print that don't work well in audiovisual media, and there are ways in which sometimes you have to make changes in an adaptation. So none of these movies are totally faithful to the books, and I'm not expecting that. What I'm looking for is, are the changes that are made good ones? Do they strengthen the story somehow or help it to work better in its new format? And are the important things left in? The things that are really important in terms of either plot, theme, or characterization of the main characters. Secondly, what I'm looking for is, do these stories stand on their own? Or do you have to know the plot of the book and know the details that were left out in order to make sense of them? I'm not looking at this in terms of my favorite books or in terms of my favorite movies or which ones I think were done the best. That's really kind of almost irrelevant. I'm just looking at the book to movie adaptation, and therefore there will be some on this list that I really like the book or the movie but that rank low because the movie is very unfaithful to the book in ways that don't make sense. And there are ones on this list that I rank very high that I'm not actually a big fan of the book or movie, but they certainly did a good job of adapting it. So just keep that in mind. The point of this is specifically to look at them as adaptations. Going from the best to the worst, number 1 on my list is obviously Sorcerer's Stone. It's the first one, and it's by far the most faithful to the book. There are some slight changes made, like for instance when they go down the trapdoor, they encounter a much smaller number of challenges. In particular, the potions riddle, where Hermione has to figure out which bottle of potion has the potion that will take them forwards. That is completely cut out, and instead she gets her heroic moment in the Devil's Snare, which originally she was supposed to freak out and not know what to do, and it was supposed to be Ron who figured that out. So that is a change that's made. However, the changes are very minimal, and for the most part they seem to be for the purpose of cutting down on length, cutting out things that aren't necessarily plot relevant, and kind of streamlining the story to fit it into, a standard length movie. The story very much does stand on its own. Of course, there are things that are left out, like not just plot events, but supporting characters and details and stuff like that. But the fact that you don't know there's a history of magic class if you've only seen the movie is not what I meant when I talked about it not making sense without the book. We'll get to that later. Number 2 on my list is Chamber of Secrets. Chamber of Secrets is the second one. It's relatively short, very similar in length to Sorcerer's Stone. There are some things that are changed, and more significant things than in Sorcerer's Stone. Like, for instance, I'm not a big fan of the fact that they cut Penelope Clearwater, because I think that she was actually relatively important. First of all, the fact that she and Hermione were both found with a mirror right after Hermione figured out something important was a clue that the mirror was important. And secondly, the fact that Ginny tried to confess about what she was being made to do, but Percy interrupted and thought that she was just going to say something about him and Penelope, and it ultimately ended up being that she was actually going to tell Harry about Tom Riddle's diary. That's important foreshadowing that it might be Ginny. Penelope was also the only Ravenclaw student who was attacked, and so with Justin from Hufflepuff and then multiple characters from Gryffindor being attacked, that sets up the situation where everybody's looking at Slytherin and saying it's gotta be one of them because none of them have been attacked, and also, the heir of Slytherin and all that. So it's a very small change, but it's one that I feel like the movie would have been stronger if it had been included. And then also a lot of the foreshadowing about Ginny being the one who was doing it is completely cut out. All the stuff where she has extreme reactions to the petrifications and Fred and George joking about the heir of Slytherin, and of course the interaction I described between her, Harry, and Percy in that scene towards the end. It makes it so that even though it's not obvious she's doing it, when it's revealed that she was being possessed by Tom Riddle and being forced to do it, it all kind of makes sense. There are much fewer hints at that in the movie, and all that I can really remember is Lucius Malfoy putting the diary in her cauldron, which if you pause it at the right moment, you actually can see. But really, I feel like in the movie, there isn't enough to make it like an, oh, of course, why didn't I see that kind of moment, which the early Harry Potter books are essentially mysteries, and so you kind of need that. However, I actually do think that there were some positive changes in this one as well, especially during the encounter between Harry and Tom Riddle when Harry fights the basilisk. In the book, it's a very anticlimactic scene. I mean, he just he grabs the sword of Gryffindor and he stabs it and then it's over. However, in the movie, they come up with this whole complicated thing where he's running from it and then hiding and then, coming back, and it's not until he's been chased around by a snake quite a bit that he ends up stabbing it with the sword of Gryffindor. And it just makes it a little bit more suspenseful and exciting, so I do like that addition to it. So all in all, Chamber of Secrets changes a little bit more than Sorcerer's Stone and has some things that I feel like would have been better to keep more like the book, but on the other hand, they also make a change that I think improves how the story unfolds, and it's still very, very similar to the book. We haven't gotten to anything where they left out things that are going to make the story not make sense, or they changed things that really shouldn't have been changed because why on earth would you do that, or anything like that. Number 3 on my list is Deathly Hallows Part 1. Now, Deathly Hallows Part 1 is definitely not totally faithful to the book, and it couldn't be because the movies that lead up to it are not at all faithful to the books, and they change things that then Deathly Hallows has to compensate for. For instance, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the book, Sirius gives Harry a mirror, and it's connected to another mirror that Sirius has so that they can use them to talk back and forth while Harry is at school. Harry never actually uses it in Order of the Phoenix and actually forgets that he has it until the end. So it's easy to see why that would have been left out of Order of the Phoenix, since it ultimately doesn't seem to be all that important. However, in Deathly Hallows, Harry has a broken piece of the same mirror that the enchantment is still working on it, and Mundungus Fletcher has stolen the other end of it and sold it to Aberforth Dumbledore. And at a critical moment in Deathly Hallows, Harry's able to use that broken piece of mirror to let Aberforth Dumbledore know that he and his friends are in trouble. The fact that that mirror was left out of Order of the Phoenix leaves you wondering in Deathly Hallows Part 1, why on earth is Harry running around with a broken piece of mirror, and why does he keep seeing somebody else's eye in it? Another example is the locket. In Order of the Phoenix, the book version, Harry and his friends help Sirius and Mrs. Weasley clean out Grimmauld Place. And in the process of doing that, they find a large golden locket that no one can open. And in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, that becomes really important. When they figure out that Regulus Black was R.A.B. and they start looking for, what might have happened to the locket after he stole it, they remember, oh yeah, there was one. And even though it's gone by this point, that's a sign that they're on the right track. In the movie, however, they cut the conversation from Order of the Phoenix where Sirius told Harry about him, so Harry doesn't even know enough to know that he would be a likely candidate. And they cut the fact that they had found a locket that fit the description of what they're looking for at Grimmauld Place 2 years ago. So why in the movie do they jump to the conclusion that they figured out who wrote the note the first time they find someone whose initials match? However, a lot of this is stuff that I really can't get upset with Deathly Hallows Part 1 for. The biggest changes that don't have to do with things that were left out of previous books are the Harry and Hermione dance scene, which personally I don't have a problem with. It was an interesting choice because they knew at this point that Ron and Hermione were going to be together as a couple, and so it seems a little bit like, please don't push this as a love triangle, please don't. But on the other hand, it is kind of a sweet scene, and it's not overtly romantic, so I can go with it. And then leaving out most of the backstory involving Dumbledore and Grindelwald, on the one hand, it's the only thing that really could be cut without making major plot changes, but then on the other hand, it was such a big part of Harry's character development in that final book to understand that the person that he had looked up to all those years was not as perfect as he had thought, and to have to come to terms with that. The whole, don't put people up on pedestals because they're gonna disappoint you kind of thing, I think was an important theme, and having that completely cut out from the movie, for one thing, it paints Dumbledore as a much more perfect kind of character than he really was, and then for another thing, I think it does severely cut into Harry's character development. And then following up on Deathly Hallows Part 1, the fourth one on my list is Deathly Hallows Part 2. It sticks very closely in a lot of ways to the source material, and nothing really big is cut that I can remember. I'm not going to complain about, Harry not going to see Ravenclaw Tower, although I would have really liked to see what they would do with Ravenclaw Tower and, get a movie interpretation of that. But, I get it, time, and more important things to do. But what I do have a big problem with is not evacuating the castle. So, in the book, after the professors find out that they're about to be under attack, they agreed to try and defend the school against Voldemort to give Harry time to find what he needs to find. However, their first priority is to get the younger students out, and anyone who's not willing to fight. They gather everybody in the Great Hall, they explain what's going on, they send them out one house at a time to the Room of Requirement, where they're able to evacuate to Hogsmeade and presumably either disapparate from there or just wait in the village until it's over. This would have been probably too long of a scene to have play out in detail in the movie, but I really don't like what they replaced it with, which is basically just nothing. They didn't get the first years out when we know there's a way that they could have done it, and when they did it in the book. And I think it would have been relatively easy to show something along those lines happening just without going through the full explanation and everything. Just have Professor McGonagall say if there's going to be a battle, we need to get the younger students out, and then show groups of students being taken to the Room of Requirement, and then switch back to the main characters doing what they're doing. Like, how long would that have taken? 30 seconds? The other thing that really bothers me is the final duel between Harry and Voldemort. I don't really care that they made it more exciting or more, throwing spells around and less talking. However, it really bothers me that the final duel does not take place in front of witnesses. In the book, the duel took place in the Great Hall. Everybody from both sides who was still there and still, alive and conscious was watching. They each say what they have to say, they cast their spells, Voldemort's backfires, and he falls to the ground, leaving behind a body in front of a room full of witnesses. It's easy to see in the book why that was the final moment of the war. In the movie, on the other hand, he dissolves and doesn't leave behind a body, and nobody saw the final battle between him and Harry. I feel like in the movie, it's not realistic that the battle would have ended at that point, let alone that the war would have ended. I feel like Voldemort's followers, not seeing him die and not seeing any body left behind, would have assumed that, hey, he came back from a disappearance once, he's gonna do it again, and at least some of them would have kept fighting, and therefore the Order of the Phoenix and the rest of, the good guys would have had to keep fighting as well. The movie ending does not make sense to me. At this point, though, this is still one of the well-done adaptations. It hits all of the key moments from the books, it dramatizes them in a way that makes sense on screen. Despite the controversy over one book being adapted into more than one movie, which I think has been done well and been done badly, but is often just kind of an attempt to squeeze more money out of a franchise, I do think that in this case it was justified. For the most part, neither of the Deathly Hallows movies deal with the difficulties that Goblet of Fire, Order of the Phoenix, and HalfBlood Prince did in adapting a very long book to a normal-length movie. So I think that in the end, that probably was a good choice that helped to make them stronger adaptations. I actually really like Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, both the book and the movie. However, in terms of the movie as an adaptation of the book, it comes in right in the middle in my opinion. It does at least bear a strong resemblance to the book and hits most of the same plot points and deals with a lot of the same themes. However, I mentioned when I talked about Chamber of Secrets that essentially the early Harry Potter books are mystery novels, and I think that this is the point where that was still very much the case in the books, but it stopped really being the case in the movies. So, in the book version of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, there's a twist, which is that Sirius was innocent and was framed, and Peter Pettigrew, who was thought to be dead, actually committed the murders that Sirius was accused of. And we get this whole explanation that basically seems to come straight out of an Agatha Christie novel. You know what I mean? If you've ever read a mystery novel where at the end of it, Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot or whoever sits down and explains, this happened and then this happened and then this person seemed to have an alibi but they really didn't, and oh, this person was framed but we know it's not them because this, that, and the other thing. It's like that. That's how Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban ends in the book. They get a thorough explanation of the whole backstory behind it and why it happened and how it happened and whatnot. In the movie, all we get is, oh yeah, this one was innocent and that one framed him and isn't actually dead. No explanation about their friendship at school, about the Marauders map and where that came from, who created it, how they became animagi. Animaguses? I don't know. Anyway, how they learned to turn into animals. The whole thing with the Secret Keeper spell and how that works, and how Sirius was the only one who could have betrayed them unless he wasn't the Secret Keeper and it was really Peter Pettigrew, and in which case he was the only one who could have betrayed them. How Professor Lupin was linked to all of this and why Sirius hadn't told him that they had changed Secret Keepers. None of that gets explained in the movie. It's not that the story doesn't work without that, it's that it doesn't work as a mystery with a twist ending without that. For that matter, they make it a really big deal that Sirius is the first person to ever escape from Azkaban and nobody can figure out how he did it. but they never tell us how he did it in the movies. You can assume that maybe it had something to do with him being able to turn into a dog, but it's not really said. And I know that it's an adaptation and you cannot keep everything from the book version in the movie, especially long explanations and whatnot, but listen to this. They had time for the frog choir, they had time for the talking shrunken head, they had time for Harry using the Lumos charm at home at the Dursleys despite not being allowed to use magic outside of school. Why on earth was there not time for at least part of that explanation? Okay, moving on. Order of the Phoenix is the longest book by quite a lot, but it's adapted into one of the shortest movies. And in fact, if you take into account that the shortest movie is one of the Deathly Hallows ones that only covers part of a book, Order of the Phoenix has by far the worst page count or word count to screen time ratio. And as a result, it leaves out a ton of stuff. Some of those things can be kind of excused, like, okay, so the Quidditch subplot, for instance, is interesting in the books, and it's important for Ron's character development, but it's not really that important. I mean, the movie is fine without it. We just forget that they all play Quidditch for a year or assume that it's happening off screen and isn't particularly interesting this time around. Like, I can go with that, sort of. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries gets cut down by quite a bit, but again, it's like, okay, so we don't see quite as much of what the Department of Mysteries contains aside from the Hall of Prophecy and the Room with the Veil. But we do still get Harry and his friends fighting Death Eaters and then the Order of the Phoenix coming to their rescue, and I mean, they got the important stuff. I do think that the Order of the Phoenix movie did a good job of putting the Hogwarts students versus Umbridge thing front and center, because that was an important part of the plot in the book, and it is something that, you know, I mean, it's easy to portray in a really exciting way for the movies as compared to, for instance, Harry's occlumency lessons and his nightmares about Voldemort and whatnot. However, there are several things that were left out of the Order of the Phoenix movie that become kind of a problem in Deathly Hallows. I already mentioned the mirror and the locket, so I won't get into those too much more, and in the defense of the people that made Order of the Phoenix, Deathly Hallows, the book, came out the same year as Order of the Phoenix, the movie, so there's a lot that they wouldn't have known while they were making decisions about what to cut. It does ultimately make it harder for the series to stand on its own as a story without being, you know, backed up by the books, without somebody being familiar with the books, which, as I said before, I really think that adaptations should stand on their own without familiarity with the source material. But I do understand also that adapting an ongoing series of books while they're still coming out can result in difficulty in knowing, you know, what's going to be important. Another thing that falls into that same category is Snape's worst memory. In the movie, it's not identified as his worst memory, but it's definitely portrayed as something that's haunting him and that's traumatic for him. Certainly the bullying that he experienced as a child was not a good memory, but what's really important about that in the books is that he called Lily a mudblood. Now that seems to be incidental in the first read-through and maybe just a sign that, okay, so he was prejudiced, but upon rereading it in the context of his backstory revealed in Deathly Hallows, it's clear that that was his worst memory because that's the day that he lost her friendship and any chance of her reciprocating his feelings. So leaving Lily out of that flashback means that it kind of misses the point. There's a lot of that going on in Order of the Phoenix, things that kind of miss the point because the books were still coming out and the point wasn't necessarily clear yet. However, I will say that as far as I can remember, there are no glaring omissions that make Order of the Phoenix or HalfBlood Prince, which had already come out in book form at the time, not make any sense. The story pretty much stands on its own, is internally consistent, and makes sense, despite having cut and changed a lot of things from the source material. So it doesn't rank at the total bottom of the list. It's just one where I feel like the disadvantages of adapting an ongoing book series and the difficulties of adapting a long book into a short movie are very obvious. Goblet of Fire was the first of the really long books to be adapted into a movie, and I feel like that probably didn't help. It basically, in my opinion, kind of skims the surface of the plot, but doesn't ever really delve into it. It hits all the main points. You have the 3 tasks of the Triwizard Tournament, the Quidditch World Cup, the Yule Ball, the Battle in the Graveyard, but there's really not a lot to string those together. A lot of the interpersonal stuff and character development gets either left out or just kind of not played to its fullest potential. A lot of the world building gets overlooked, which is a problem in that this is the book where the world building starts to expand. Through the Triwizard Tournament, more information is given about other magical schools. Through characters like Percy Weasley and Barty Crouch Sr., more information is given about the Ministry of Magic. Through the flashbacks that Harry sees, you learn more about the First War against Voldemort. It's the first book that really starts to hint at some of the underlying issues in the magical world, like for instance Hermione's campaign for house elf rights and the fact that they don't really have any, and the fact that Sirius was sent to Azkaban without a trial and things like that. All that gets kind of glossed over or left out. Now, admittedly, a lot of that kind of gets dropped in the last book, where the problems go from, subtle underlying things that nobody really acknowledges to be problems to, oh my goodness, Voldemort is literally running the Ministry of Magic. But this is the book where the magical world gets to be a little bit more complex and nuanced, and the movie just kind of doesn't. But the biggest problem that I have by far with the Goblet of Fire movie, Barty Crouch Jr. Okay, so remember what I said before about how the books are mysteries. The first 4 books are essentially mystery novels that happen to take place at a school for magic. The mystery in this one is who put Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire. But in the movie, there's barely any mystery to it. It's more a question of how as opposed to who. Because at the very, very beginning of the movie, Barty Crouch Jr. is shown to still be alive. He's there in the scene where Voldemort and Wormtail are talking. Later, Harry identifies the man that he saw in the Pensieve memories as the same one that was in his dream. Now, it's still a twist that Professor Moody is an imposter and is actually Barty Crouch Jr. under Polyjuice Potion. However, even that isn't really properly explained. And it's never really explained either how Barty Crouch Jr. faked his death and escaped from Azkaban, or what he's been doing in all these years in the meantime. Never mind the fact that in the book, the memories concerning him and what Dumbledore and Sirius both say about him makes it very ambiguous as to whether he was guilty or not. Therefore, when it's revealed that he's the one who entered Harry into the Triwizard Tournament and turned the Triwizard Cup into a portkey in order to get Harry to the graveyard, it's surprising in multiple ways. It's surprising because we didn't know that he was in disguise as Professor Moody. It's surprising because we didn't know he was still alive, and it's surprising because we didn't know if he had ever been in support of Voldemort in the first place or if he was another innocent wrongly accused like Sirius. I would venture to say that Goblet of Fire does not stand on its own as a story, the movie version. There's just so much that's left out of it, particularly concerning the central mystery of who put Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire and the eventual answer to that I'm not sure it would make any sense if one hadn't read the books and couldn't fill in the details for themselves. However, the one that I feel like is the least successful as an adaptation is HalfBlood Prince. So as far as I'm concerned, there were 4 main plot lines in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, which in order of importance would be, number 1, Harry and Dumbledore investigating Voldemort's backstory, trying to find out how he went from Tom Riddle to Voldemort, how he made himself immortal, how he can be made mortal again, setting the stage for everything that's going to happen in Deathly Hallows. I said that Deathly Hallows Part 1 had some things from Order of the Phoenix that, because they were left out of the movies, it had to struggle to accommodate them. But both Deathly Hallows movies also suffer from the things that were left out of Half-Blood Prince. And by the time that the Half-Blood Prince movie was being made, Deathly Hallows had already been published. So there's less of an excuse there. Number 2 is Harry trying to investigate what Malfoy and Snape are up to, while everybody kind of looks at him and goes, yeah, they're not up to anything, you're imagining things. And then at the end, of course, it's revealed that he was absolutely right. Now, this is included, and I think it gets pretty sufficient screen time in proportion to other things. However, I think that the way it's portrayed kind of misses the point. This is one where, again, I feel like the mystery aspect of the books was kind of missed. The fact that we follow Malfoy into the Room of Requirement and see what he's working on and know that the thing that he was buying in Borgin and Burke's was a vanishing cabinet, that gives away too much. There's much less mystery. In the book, it's very much like Harry thinks that there's something going on, but there's enough plausible deniability around it that maybe Ron and Hermione are right and he's just jumping to conclusions. So those are the 2 main plot lines as far as I'm concerned. And I feel like it makes sense that those would be the focal points of the story because that's where the story leads in the end. The plotline with Harry and Dumbledore investigating Voldemort leads them to the cave with the potion and the locket, and the plotline with Harry suspecting Snape and Malfoy of being up to something leads to the astronomy tower and what happens there. We've also got the question of who was the Half-Blood Prince, which is clearly important because, first of all, it's part of the title, and then secondly, the answer is revealed towards the end, in the middle of all of, the climax type stuff. It's also woven pretty seamlessly into the plotline where Harry is investigating Snape and Malfoy, particularly when he uses Sectum Sempra against Malfoy, And when, after the thing on the astronomy tower, he attempts to use one of the Half-Blood Prince's curses against Snape, prompting Snape to reveal himself as the Half-Blood Prince. All those moments do make it into the movie, however, there's something important that was left out in terms of, like, okay, so if this is going to be called Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, then we need a thorough explanation for the Half-Blood Prince thing. And in the book, we get one. Hermione thinks that it's this woman who she found who won some potions awards, who was called Aileen Prince, but then after Snape reveals that it was him, they find that she was actually Snape's mother. So on his mother's side, he came from a magical family with the last name Prince, and on his father's side, his father was a Muggle, so he's half-blood in terms of Muggle father, witch mother, and his mother's last name was Prince, Half-Blood Prince. That's where he got the name from. So I said before that there were 4 major plot lines in Half-Blood Prince, and I've talked about 3 of them. The 4th one is the teenage romance, which is like 90% of what the movie is. Which to me is really jarring, because the book and the movie both have one of the most depressing endings. I feel like that stuff being in the book is actually important, because Half-Blood Prince is the last book where Harry, or for that matter most of his peers, will be able to just be kids. In Deathly Hallows, whether they're on the run or back at Hogwarts, they're definitely being made to grow up too fast and not really able to just worry about Quidditch games and who's dating who. So that being a part of the book and Harry and his friends being able to experience sort of a normal teenage experience first before they all go off to war, that's important. But it's a subplot in the book, and it's the main plot in the movie up until near the end. And then I can't talk about the Half-Blood Prince movie without talking about something that was added that did not need to be added. And that's the scene where the Death Eaters burn down the Weasleys' house. Like, I do get that they were trying to show how dangerous the world had become, but like, that was a really weird choice for something to add. First of all, it doesn't happen in the book, and the Weasleys' house is perfectly fine in Deathly Hallows. They host a wedding there. And then secondly, I talked about how many of the Voldemort memories were cut, right? You're telling me they chose to include the burrow burning down over seeing how Voldemort stole Slytherin's locket and Hufflepuff's cup from that one lady? Or seeing him interview for the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, and therefore knowing that he came back to Hogwarts as an adult and having an explanation for how on earth he hid the diadem there? Yeah, I don't feel like that was a good choice. So the reason that Half-Blood Prince ranks at the bottom of this list is that not only does it not really work as an adaptation of the book, like it doesn't fit the same themes, prioritize the same plot lines, or, you know, so on and so forth, but it makes it so that things have to be changed in order for future installments to work well, with the full knowledge of what was going to be happening in Deathly Hallows, because the book was out at that point. And like, the main point of Half-Blood Prince as a book, movie, whatever, is to lay the groundwork for Deathly Hallows. And the movie just doesn't really accomplish that. Anyway, I know that this video seemed very negative, and I don't actually dislike these movies, and my thoughts on them as adaptations don't really reflect my thoughts on them as just stories. In fact, the Prisoner of Azkaban and Order of the Phoenix movies I really, really like, despite the fact that they're definitely not faithful to the books that they're based on. But as far as looking at them specifically as adaptations of books, I feel like the first 2 and the last 2 are definitely the strongest, although certainly not by any means perfect. Half-Blood Prince is definitely the weakest, although it does have its good points. And the ones in the middle I have very mixed feelings about. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this. What are your thoughts on them? Which ones do you think made the best adaptations, or the worst ones? Feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you liked this and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday.